How's this work? 2 segments. First segment, I'm going to chat with you for a little bit. Talk to you about some history, talk to you about some anatomy and physiology, and talk to you about some pathology. Pathology, how you get sick. And then we'll take a break, and then the second half we'll work on skills around the CPR and the AED. As I often joke with folks, this is arguably the most important lecture that you'll hear in your life. Why? Because I'm going to teach you how this thing works. Not how it functions, how it actually works for you, and how you can work against it. And it's been a little misleading over the years because it's been put into a very mechanical situation. The problem is that this thing feels too. And so it's not all mechanical, and I'll show you how that all works. Now, CPR has a bit of history with it, which is important to recognize. One of which is that if you had a cardiac arrest in 1970, by the way, what is a cardiac arrest? Cardiac stands for what? Heart, and arrest is what? Stop. So they are fundamentally what? If my heart stopped, what would I be? Dead. Good. It's really good. Oftentimes people are like, oh, they're having a heart attack. And I'm like, oh, no. The heart attack came before that. They're dead now. Okay? So in 1970, if you would have gone in to cardiac arrest and it was witnessed, you would have had a 7% chance of surviving it. 7% chance. Okay. The big problem is that we weren't actually teaching CPR for cardiac arrest. We were teaching CPR for drowning because more people were dying of drowning then. And ironically, more people die of cardiac arrest today. We should get back in the water, but I digress. So what we've got going on here is that you had a 7% chance of survival, which is incredibly low. And then in 1980s, and we started teaching CPR back in the 50s, but it wasn't until 1986 that we came up with a standard for education. Yeah, pre-hospital standard for education in 1986. Some of you aren't old enough to be alive for that, but most of you were. That's problematic to think about. There was no standard for pre-hospital medicine, meaning that the people that came and helped you in an ambulance, their level of training, as I like to refer to, is that they were pavement scrapers. They would scrape you off of the pavement, put you onto a gurney, load you into the ambulance, and get you to the hospital as quickly as possible. The level of training that you had was based on the area of the country that you were in. Meaning, if you were near Boston, if you were near Pittsburgh, if you were near Salt Lake, if you were near LA, you probably had a pretty good education. Why? Because there's research medical facilities there when they actually used to do research. We don't do research anymore, the pharmaceutical companies do. But I'll come back to that. And so in 1986, we created this pre-hospital standard, and then we started doing research on the standards that we were providing. And so for some of you, you've done CPR and you've said, is this going to change again? Meaning there was a period of time roughly from 1998 until about 2015 where it changed every 3 to 4 years. And it was frustrating for people. The problem is we didn't know what we were doing. Thankfully, today, we have a pretty good standard that we've been holding on to for about the last 10 years now. We've changed some speed, we've changed some minor things, but in general, it stayed the same. Now, today, if you have a witnessed cardiac arrest, you have up to an 84% chance of survival. Now, that's possibility, that's not probability. Meaning, if everything goes absolutely right, 84% of the time we can have a save. But everything doesn't go right all the time. And here's why. Because the standard is a bit difficult to meet. So we call this the cardiac chain of survival. There's 5 components to it. The first 3 are hours. The last 2 are professional standard, and what it comes down to is that if we don't meet the first 3 components of this, well, it's going to be impossible to get to that 84% chance of survival. So what do we need to do? So one, we need to have a witnessed event. And so within the first minute of arrest, we want what we refer to as an early 911. So we want to call out. The next thing we want within the first minute of arrest is we want early compressions. Early compressions. Now what's important to recognize is that your heart, what does your heart create in your system? Does anybody know what it creates when it pumps? Well, the electrical activity actually causes it to pump. When it is pumping, anybody know what we call that? Put that thing on your arm. Blood pressure, right? Yeah, exactly. So when you go into cardiac arrest, your pump stops and your blood pressure starts to drop. So the biggest problem in cardiac arrest is, or I should say, not necessarily with cardiac arrest, but with cardiac arrest and compressions, is that we cannot increase pressure with compressions. We can maintain it. So the sooner we can get on the chest of the individual and start beginning compressions, the higher we maintain blood pressure, which maintains perfusion, specifically getting blood up to the brain in order to provide oxygen. So this is very key. If you don't get on within the first minute, we start to see cellular death occurring, and then individuals have a harder time surviving. They're less likely to survive. Now, the next piece of this is that we need an early AED. Now, this is the automated external defibrillator. Now, bear with me here. We want an AED on the individual within 1 to 2 minutes of arrest. Now, I understand in Teton County this may be pretty difficult depending on where you're working, if you're working on the river or if you're working in a wilderness setting, etc. The point is this. This is most successful. We also know that individuals that get early compressions and we interrupt them as little as possible, they last longer. And so they have more of an opportunity. But in a perfect world, we want to get the AED on folks early. Now the AED, what is it? So the AED is 2 pads that stick to the chest. They've got cables that run back to the actual unit. The unit's battery powered. What does it do? Well, it puts about 330 joules of electricity into the individual if they're in what we refer to as ventricular fibrillation. What is ventricular fibrillation? Well, when the heart goes into cardiac arrest, it's an artifact of cardiac arrest, and it's somewhat unique because it only happens with heart disease. This doesn't happen with congenital issues. So if you're born with a congenital heart deficit, okay, the heart's not functioning properly, it's mechanical. When that heart stops, CPR doesn't work because the heart has a malfunction with it. In cardiac arrest, the heart is fine. It's the vessels that are clogging the blood to the heart. I hope you understand that in a bit. Now, when the heart goes into cardiac arrest, sometimes the nervous system is still intact. What does that mean, Jake? Well, what it means is this. A lot of you have been around animals when they've been killed. So specifically around a fish is probably the easiest one to think about, where it's like you've gutted it, you've taken the entrails out of it, and you're going to take the head off of the thing, and the thing jumps out of your hand. It's dead, right? But there's electricity in it. And the electricity is engaging with the nervous system and it's causing that muscle twitch. Well, that happens sometimes with the human body, except what it does is it causes one chamber in the heart to wobble. All the other, the whole heart is stopped, but the electricity comes in and it makes the left ventricle wobble. If those pads can sense that wobble, which it's made to do, and so if it's wobbling, it will pick it up. And then it will say, stand clear, let's charge the battery up, and then hit the button when it says it. And we're going to put the electricity back into the heart with the intent of cardio-converting that wobble back into a beating heart. It's fascinating, okay? And basically, there's an AV node that manages the electrical impulses, and ultimately there's a complete misfire that's gone on with the heart. And so it's an abnormal rhythm with electricity that it's incapable of turning into a beating heart on its own. And when we throw electricity into it, we can convert it back into a beating heart, okay? Now, this is ideal. The reality of it is that if you're working in a wilderness situation, we need to be able to size up what happens before this, which is the heart attack, okay? Because if we can size up a heart attack, we can call 911 far before they go into cardiac arrest, and get rescue services moving towards us. We can also treat a heart attack with some medication. We'll talk about that in a little bit, simple thing called aspirin. And so we'll focus on the majority of that. And then if we have to, then we're gonna move into the CPR skills. The other two pieces of the cardiac chain of survival move into what we refer to as early ALS, advanced life support. This is simply the ambulance. So this is within 6 to 10 minutes. So this is national call time nationwide in an urban environment. And so for instance, while we're not an urban environment, our call times are pretty good. You may not have an ambulance show up, but I'll guarantee you if you're in an urban environment, and when I say urban environment, I mean on a road, there's a good chance you're going to have a first responder in this county get to you with an AED. It's probably going to be a park ranger, a sheriff, a state police, could be an off-duty firefighter, could be an off-duty EMS, okay? And so those folks will get toned out ahead of the ambulance in an effort to get a trained responder to you earlier with resources. Because the ambulances are in specific places. The first responders are scattered throughout the valley. The last piece of this is what we refer to as definitive care. This is within 1 hour, and this is delivery to the emergency room. And so within 1 hour of the initial 911 call in the urban environment, this is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get folks to the ER within an hour's period of time. The other thing that's important to recognize is that we travel with, or I should say we rescue with helicopters in this valley. And depending on your location, sometimes they'll just deliver an AED to you with a helicopter depending on the location. Hence, being able to size up that heart attack becomes even more important, because the more extended the situation, the farther you're out, the less time that individual has. Okay? Questions, comments in regards to the cardiac chain of survival? Anybody? Okay. All right, here we go. I'm going to jump into a little bit of anatomy and physiology with you in order to help you understand what's happening in the body and specifically what's happening with us. And so this is a healthy vessel. And what I mean by that is that anything that carries fluid in it, and specifically maybe in your body carrying blood, delivering blood to the cells in order to deliver oxygen to the cells, that's perfusion. Your vessels need to be in that shape to be able to be healthy. And so for instance, Every vessel that carries fluid in it is this shape, every one of them, because it's the most efficient shape in order for fluid to flow through it. It's the least amount of resistance. And so the take home with this is that if I went into your home and I changed the pipes in your house, I turned your water pump off and I changed the pipes to this configuration, and then I turned your water pump on, I would blow your water pump up in your house in like 30 seconds. And the reason is because of the amount of resistance in the shape itself. That's how much friction occurs with it. And so the take home with it is that your pump is your heart and your pipes are your vessels. You get crap in your pipes, well, your pump has to work harder. And at the end of the day, the harder your heart works, the harder your days. It's really what it comes down to. It doesn't necessarily mean you have less days. Because that's the other thing that's goofy here, because you can drill a pack of cigarettes every day of the week and you can be the anomaly and you can live to 105, but that's the anomaly. Those are rare. Those are outliers. Okay? And so, but what I can guarantee you is that if you can decrease the resistance and decrease the resistance in the pipe, increase the efficiency of the heart, your days start getting better. So let's take a look at this in a little bit different way here. So your heart has the capacity, or I should say, your heart will change in beats per minute based on the stimuli you provide it. Okay? So for instance, here's something worth trying to wrap your head around, which is that when you exercise, your heart rate goes up, correct? And initially, if you're not warmed up, you may feel a little bit of pressure on your heart. And then you slow down, and then you come into it a little bit slower. But then later on, like say if you're just running or jogging, and then later on as you're warmed up, you can actually get back up to speed, and you don't feel that pressure anymore. Well, what happens is that your vessels actually change size. They're elastic. They have to be. Think about it. If the heart rate increases, well, the blood pressure would increase unless the vessel would change size. And so by the vessel changing size, we're able to maintain the same blood pressure regardless of where our heart rate is. That's in a relaxed situation, meaning that we actually get the vessel response to do as it's made to, meaning opening and closing appropriately. But for instance, have you ever been angry with somebody? You want to rip their head off and your heart rate goes up? It's funny because you feel the pressure in your chest. You don't feel it here. You're pissed off at them here, right? Now, what's going on is you're actually getting a stress response. And so what occurs is that the vessel actually gets tighter and the heart rate goes up. And so your blood pressure goes through the roof, okay? That's why you get that angst feeling where it's like, I want to rip your head off, okay? I really don't want to rip your head off, but you know what I'm getting at, right? Okay, so if you take this concept and recognize that we have a vessel that can do two things, okay? It can get smaller and it can get bigger. Now, when the vessel gets smaller, we call this vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction. So this is a stress response. We call it fight or flight. And what happens is that your heart rate increases, your respiratory rate increases, your blood pressure increases, and your oxygen saturation decreases. So with more effort, you get less product. Now, we accommodate for the less oxygen by having an endocrine response. Okay, so we have a hormonal release through our endocrine system, and it provides us with adrenaline and cortisol. Okay, adrenaline and cortisol. What does adrenaline do? Well, specifically, it cranks up your heart rate. Okay, that's exactly what it does. It's also toxic to your heart. What does cortisol do? Well, you're not getting enough oxygen, so the cortisol comes into the bloodstream through the hormonal release, and it causes your liver to secrete sugar, stored sugar. Okay, now check this out. That sugar, well, you don't get it into the cells, but it's trapped in the bloodstream. Huh, what? Yeah, have you ever seen like an 8-year-old, 12-year-old kid that's been drilling Mountain Dew, and they're like, they're like totally cracked out? They don't have any energy. They're not getting enough energy to the cells. They're actually not getting enough oxygen either. But what their body has done is it's trapped the sugar in the bloodstream, and it makes you crazy. Okay? That's exactly what happens. Now, in this particular situation, nobody's drinking Mountain Dew. The body is actually producing this. Now, this is incredibly helpful if you have a physical threat. Meaning if you have a life threat, somebody is physically trying to harm you. This is amazing. Why? Because it turns 125 pounds of me into an animal, right? Okay? You wouldn't want to deal with me with a huge adrenaline and a big cortisol dump. I'd scratch you, I'd dig at your eyes, I would do everything possible in order to get you away from me. I'm a little guy, okay? But that's where the fight comes from, fight or flight. Or it would cause me to run like hell and get away from everybody. That's when this is helpful. Why? Because you actually have a physical response to burn it off, okay? The problem is that we have fight or flight responses all the time around stressful environments that are not life threats, but they're social or work related, okay? Now, ultimately, just by being in a low-level stressful situation, you're having this occur. This is arguably the problem that we have within all developing countries within the United States. So let me put this into perspective for you. In the last 50 years, we've seen, I like to bring this into here because stress is part of this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but we've seen a 50% decline in fertility over the last 50 years. A 50% decline in fertility in the last 50 years. And in developed countries. And we measure that through men. And basically what we see is that men's potency, men's capacity to create sperm has decreased by 1% over the last 50 years. And that's consistent across all developed countries. Now, the thing that's fascinating about it is that we've also seen a decline in health over the last 50 years as well. More fascinating is that developing countries have only gotten our technology over the last 20 years. They have caught up with us. And so what I'm getting at here is that stress reduces fertility. Stress actually also reduces the capacity to gain nutrition as well. Okay? So as I often joke with the women, you're trying to get pregnant, quit doing in vitro. It's actually your partner that's more likely the problem. It's actually men that are losing their potency. Don't get me wrong, women are too, but men have lost it very rapidly. Okay? And ultimately, it's because of low-level stress that we're dealing with. Now, that's our fight or flight. That's our adrenaline. That's our cortisol. Now, on the other side of this, we have what we call vasodilation. And this is a relaxed response. This is what we call feed or breed. In here, the heart rate decreases, the respiratory rate decreases, the blood pressure decreases, and the O2 saturation increases. Yeah. And so with less effort, we get more product here. Now, the hormonal release over here is things like, oh, it's not cortisol. It's things like serotonin, things like, whoops, oxytocin, okay? And these are feel-good hormones. These are feel-good hormones. And so if we look at this from the standpoint that the vessel gets larger, it becomes more permeable, and it allows blood to pass through the vessel wall to deliver oxygen to the cell easier with less effort. So meaning with less blood pressure, you actually get more oxygen. And that's a function of the vessel actually just relaxing and allowing the blood to pass through it, whereas when the vessel is tighter, it doesn't let the blood pass through to the cells. If we look at this from the feed or breed, I find this very fascinating because if we look at a research study that started in the 60s in the Middle East, and what they were doing is they were looking at individuals that were following a traditional Muslim practice around a traditional Middle Eastern diet versus individuals that were eating a traditional Middle Eastern diet that were adopting a Western lifestyle. And that may seem a little ridiculous, but if you were in the Middle East in the 60s, it was actually pretty hip. Like Iran, people were going to college, like women were wearing pants. It looked like the United States. That may seem hard to believe, but that's exactly what was going on at the Middle East at that time. The thing that's fascinating is that the people in the Middle East were actually concerned about the lifestyle. They were like, there's something weird going on here. We're not sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing. So they started to study it around food. What they found out very quickly was that individuals who were praying over their food were gaining more nutrition from their food. Yeah, exactly. They repeated this study over and over and over and over again. And they kept coming up with the same thing. They're like, this is wild. The only thing these people are doing different is they're praying. And they're getting more nutrition. Well, when we looked at that study, we were like, okay, praying, whatever. It looks like when people pause over their food, they gain more nutrition. And then in the late 90s, we took this study and we really drove it into Western culture quite well. And we were like, well, let's compare it to fast food. And they looked at fast food and they looked at individuals that went through the drive-through versus individuals that went inside. And the people that went inside were gaining more nutrition from their food just by going inside and sitting down. They had to actually sit down and eat. Now, think about this. If you're in the drive-through, you're in a hurry to go somewhere. You're also doing two things at the same time, which, no matter what you want to tell me, we don't do well. We don't do two things well at a time. This whole thing of multitasking has been shown to be a complete farce. It's a joke, okay? You're ineffective. And so if you're multitasking, or if you're driving, or you're trying to get somewhere and you're driving down the road shoving food in your mouth that is already high fat, high sugar, and specifically what I should say is just high sugar, okay? Because fat's not a bad thing. It's actually sugar that's a problem. And so what's going on is the vessels are tight, and what do you want? You want something that tastes good. And so you're eating this crap that's not good for you, but it tastes, that makes you feel good. That's funny. Yeah, because that sugar in that food, because I got news for you, man. Like, I haven't had them in fucking 30 years, but a goddamn McDonald's French fries are fucking amazing, aren't they? Here's the funny thing. They were better for you 40 years ago. Do you know why? They cooked them in animal fat 40 years ago. Today, they cook them in vegetable fat. It's carcinogenic. Kind of funny, right? So what we're seeing here is that if you just slow down, if you just make time for your food, and you pause and make time for it, you'll get more nutrition out of it. Then if you actually prepare it yourself, you have a higher quality, etc. That's the feed part, okay? So just by slowing down, you get more nutrition. The breed part, I've started to talk about this a little bit, which is that, guys, you can't get jiggy unless you vasodilate. You can't get an erection unless you vasodilate. Women can't orgasm unless they vasodilate. That's why the relationship matters so much, okay? And so, and if everybody goes to a stress response, men ejaculate early and women don't orgasm, and then everybody's pissed, okay? So that's the breed piece of this. Things don't work here, they work really well here. But this is also helping you understand that this is the feeling. This is thinking, this is feeling, okay? And when I say thinking, meaning when you're stressed, you think a lot. Just put your head down and start looking at your phone. You'll get stressed. Why? Because your head's first. If you lift your head up and put your chest up, guess what? You're not going to be as stressed. Why? Because you're trying to get out of your head and you're actually getting into your heart. And you may say that's a little woo-woo, but that's actually a structural foundation of endocrine response, which is that when you stand up, when you put your shoulders back, when you lead with your heart and put your chin up and eyes forward, your immune system kicks in and says, hey, we ought to be confident. And so you deliver an endocrine response that gives you a hormonal release that provides you with more confidence. Seth?
Isn't that called the intrinsic nervous system?
It is. It is. That's exactly what's going on. And we drive the intrinsic nervous system simply through what we think, how we stand, and how we deliver. It's what it's all about. That's why faking it until you're making it is so important. Because what you're doing is you're faking it until you actually start to feel it. The thing that's important is to, once you start feeling it, to quit faking it, because if you don't, you become an asshole. Because you start thinking you know what's going on instead of believing you know what's going on and then being open to other people. That makes sense? Yeah, okay. So this is kind of the foundation. Now, when we interact with the outside world, it works two ways. We take information in through our peripheral nervous system, okay? Seeing, hearing, taste, touch, smell. I missed one. I said seeing, hearing, taste, touch. Oh, no, maybe I did get them all. Seeing, hearing, taste, touch, smell. That's how we take things in through our peripheral nervous system. That's how we experience the world. Now, most people would say, oh yeah, and then it goes from peripheral to central nervous system. And they said, yeah, and it goes up the spine into the head. And I go, yeah, it does. But the problem is that there's two brains associated with, there's actually three brains associated with your spinal cord. You have a brain in your gut, you have a brain in your heart, and you have a brain in your head. They all have mirror neurons, okay? And mirror neurons are important. Why? Because they can provide memory. So we experience the world, information comes in through the peripheral nervous system, it gets passed into the gut first. The gut gives us a binary response. The gut says, hey, run like hell or beat the shit out of this person, or it comes over and says, hey, let's fucking hang out with this and find out some more information. I think I want to be here, okay? So you get that binary response, meaning stress or relax. And then a tenth of a second later, it moves up to your heart and you're provided with a very deep feeling that gives you a spectrum of the binary, meaning relaxed. Dawson, you seem pretty good. I should get to know you a little bit better, right? Okay. Or maybe that young woman looks at you and, gives you a big smile and you're like, whoa, I definitely want to know more. Now, here's what's goofy, right? Like, boom, for all of us, like, she smiles at us and we go, oh, she's interested. But she was also just being relaxed and nice. We don't know if she's interested. There's more to it that works two different ways, meaning what you're feeling is not what other people feel. That's important to recognize, so you just have to validate, okay? You feeling this? Okay, you feeling the same thing I'm feeling? All right. So it comes up to the heart and we get this feeling. And then about a half a second later, it comes up into the brain, and the brain provides us with a judgment or opinion that's based on our past. It's fascinating, isn't it? Meaning that our brain, our cognitive bias is based on our past. And so despite what the feeling is, a lot of us have been taught, well, think about it. And if you hang out with little kids, you see this perfectly, which is they don't think about shit. And they're like, what do you mean? This is amazing. And we're like, we have to go, honey. We need to move now. And you're like, no, I'm going to play a little more, blah, 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 right? They're not thinking about anything. And as I've often joked with fathers, where they're like, I try to tell my kids what to do. And I'm like, you're talking about reason. They haven't had your experience. They didn't deal with your parents. They're feeling what they feel. And then you're trying to explain something that they don't cognitively understand because kids only feel. Kids are like pets until about the age of 7, and then they start thinking for themselves. That's what goes on. There's more to it. I won't go too much farther into it from there. But the point is that your brain gets in the way of this. Now so that's one way. That's how we take information in. That's trying to help you realize that if you feel something and then if you think it differently, your past is trying to bring a previous experience and say this is the same thing. But as I like to remind myself, if I'm meeting somebody for the first time, I'm like, I shouldn't have a bias about them. I should figure out who they are. Now here's the problem. Your brain gets into this, meaning you can have thoughts. So based on the experience that you're having, you can provide an endocrine response, or based on the thoughts you're having, you can drive an endocrine response. So for instance, if you're doing work and you're under a timeline and you're stressed, guess what? You're vasoconstricting, you're putting off adrenaline and cortisol, your heart rate's up, and the hormones that are running through your bloodstream are toxic to you. Okay? But if you're relaxed, well, not so much, and that's perception for people. Perception, because everybody's different, meaning we can put people into stressful situations, and some people are like, this is nothing. And other people are like, I want nothing to do with this. It's all perception. That's why we're all different. That's why I like to remind people, which is don't give them shit for what their perception is. Find out what they're good at, because they're probably better than that than you. That's the balance in life, okay? And so if our perception can get in the way, what we're thinking causes our heart rate to go up based on the endocrine response that we're driving through our thought. And so, for instance, if you have a negative experience and you relive it over and over and over again, your mirror neurons are so good at memory that it makes you believe you're actually in the situation. And then you start having this response over and over again. Reliving the past. It's depression. And if you're worried about the future, that's anxiety. It's all the same thing. Which is you need to be in the present moment in order to be able to, one, breathe and get enough oxygen in order to be able to stop your brain from going crazy and providing this endocrine response, okay? This happens low level. So for instance, the things that we normalize, lack of sleep. So you go less than 7 to 9 hours a night, guess what? You have a stress response next morning. That's why you feel like shit when you wake up in the morning, and then you start drilling coffee. And guess what? You increase the adrenaline, but you're used to that. You're addicted to that. And so you don't mind it so much. That's what happens. That's addiction. It's hard. It's a tough one. Because I got news. I got like the drugs are one thing. The lifestyle problem is the thing that's killing people. Okay? And so when you don't sleep enough, you create a stress response. If you eat a shitty diet, if you eat a lot of sugar, eat a lot of breads, eat a lot of sugar, drink a lot of alcohol, guess what? Stress response, okay? Stress response. Hydration. Get a little dehydrated, stress response, okay? Now, what's fascinating is that the majority, I talk about this all the time from the standpoint that if you engage with the outdoors, you have to be good enough in order to be able to engage in the outdoors. And then most of us have a big enough heart and a big enough determination in order to push through and keep making it happen. But the point is this. Imagine this, like everybody in this room is fairly healthy. Why? Because you're surrounded by fairly healthy people in a town that demands that you're fairly healthy. And as I often joke, there's a pretty good substance abuse problem in this town because nobody gets enough sleep and nobody makes enough money and everybody's worried about their mortgage, so they're stressed a little bit. That's the whole trick. This is this thing that's this balance, which is there's no balance, there's trade-offs, or there's balance. And that's the whole key here. Get enough sleep, hydrate, deal with your diet, reduce your sugar. That's what's causing health problems. And get the shitty thoughts out of your head, meaning you have to have good relationships with other people. You don't need many. We don't need much encouragement in this world. That's the beautiful thing. If you grew up in my house, you definitely realized you didn't need much encouragement. Just every once in a while, somebody would just say, "You're doing great," and you'd be like, "Awesome," because everybody else was like, "You're fucking up." But then you just hear it once every once in a while, and that gives you that encouragement in order to do better. And that's the whole trick to it. It's the whole trick to it, which is that every day we're trying to remove something that's trying to kill us, and we're trying to gain something that's going to help us live a little bit better, okay? Learning how to breathe is very important for this. Breathing techniques, I can go into it over and over again, but whether you breathe, whether you meditate, whether you deal with your diet, whether you journal, I don't care what it is, whether you do a little bit of yoga, that all falls into here. And at the end of the day, this, like I said, I'm not telling you you can have more days. I'm just telling you can have better days. That's all. So let's look at this. Does anybody have any questions? I'm going to jump into a heart attack, but does anybody have any questions on this? Okay. So how's this work? Boom. We're back to the vessel. So we come back to the vessel. Now, if you get enough sugar into the bloodstream, okay, so check this out. When you eat food, if you don't eat sugar, you don't need sugar. We don't need it. We don't need any of it. 100 years ago, there was barely any sugar on the table. Barely any. Now, your body needs glucose. Yeah, that's a sugar, but it's a metabolic glucose. It's a metabolic sugar, meaning it's created from non-sugary material. So when you eat plant-based, when you eat any plant-based, when you eat plant-based, when you eat, you can eat meat, you can eat vegetables. What your body does is that it takes that and it's like, oh, there's not any sugar here. So it goes into metabolism and it creates glucose. And then when you deliver glucose to your bloodstream, it delivers it so that it maintains an adequate blood sugar level all the time. So I'll put this into perspective for you. This took me a long time. It took me about 4 or 5 years to reduce the sugar out of my diet. Now I don't eat sugar. Now I only eat in an 8-hour window of the day. So I do an intermittent fast. And so what I'm training my body to do is to realize it has to be efficient with its fuel. And it creates glucose pretty readily out of things that have no sugar in it. Now, when you eat sugar, well, your body says, that's good enough. We don't need to make glucose. The problem is that when you eat that Snickers bar, all of the sugar goes into your bloodstream at the same time, so your blood sugar goes too high. And you're like, ding, you kind of like that. Everybody likes that because you're high. It's the same receptor, it's the same chemical receptions that get fed as when you do cocaine. It's true story. Okay, so you can do cocaine or sugar. The analgesic wise, they have different feelings, but in the brain can't tell the difference between the two. So when you take sugar in, all of that goes into the bloodstream. Boom. Blood sugar goes too high. When the blood sugar is too high, you have to have an insulin response to get rid of the sugar. And so what happens is that it takes too much sugar out. And so an hour and a half, 2 hours later, you're like, I'm hungry again. Let me eat something. And boom, you eat sugar, you have too high sugar, boom, insulin response. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the amount of insulin responses we have in life because our pancreas can only have so many, okay? Now, to put this into perspective, the other thing your pancreas does is it provides digestive juice. It's literally what we call it. It's a digestive jus that it puts into your belly. There is an unlimited supply of that in the pancreas. Unlimited supply. So you can eat and digest, but if you eat too much sugar, you'll run out of insulin eventually. That's what happens when you start putting on weight, generally around the age of 30, is that you're starting to become insulin resistant. Your insulin isn't as strong as it used to be. And so what happens is you start to build sugar up in the bloodstream. And guess what? We call that high cholesterol. Okay? All high cholesterol is that it's actual sugar in the bloodstream. And it's on a high level that can't get out. This is fascinating. I love how medicine does this, which is they're like, oh, we'll put you on a cholesterol medication. The problem is this: your body makes cholesterol when you don't eat it, and then when you eat it, your body makes less. So it's funny, we put you on a medication in order to manage the cholesterol, but nobody tells you to reduce your sugars. And if you reduce your sugars, you don't have to deal with cholesterol. But don't get me wrong, reducing your sugars is really freaking hard. Why? Because people are addicted. They feel like they're dying. They feel like they're starving, okay? And so high cholesterol. Now, if the cholesterol or the sugar is able to get into a high enough concentration, it will then become soluble and it will attach itself as a lipid, okay, to the arterial wall. And then what occurs is that it occludes the artery. So for instance, this particular vessel can only vasodilate on one side, okay? And so now when individuals get a stress response, or if they start to do something physical, they can't get as much oxygen, they start to feel pressure specifically around their cardiac region. So again, high sugar. And then this sugar is actually fat, okay? Comes from sugar. Here's an interesting tidbit. Red meat, if you're eating red meat, you should eat 50% fat, 50% lean. Why? Because the fat's actually the soluble fiber in the meat. So the more lean meat you eat, if you eat it in high quantities, more than you need, you actually store it as fat. It's kind of fascinating, right? Yeah, lean beef. No, fatty beef. If you're gonna eat meat, eat fat. It's good for you. With that being said, if you're eating a ton of sugar and you're eating a ton of fat, not so good. So you still have to reduce the sugar. So this vessel can only change size a little bit. Now, with the heart attack, what's going on is this. We've got an occlusion here. Now, the heart muscle itself needs to get perfused with oxygen as well. And so, under normal circumstances, it is capable of getting blood through the occlusion and providing enough oxygen to the heart muscle itself. So the heart is pushing blood out to the body, but then it also perfuses itself as well. It has a little mini circulatory system. Now, if this heart gets a stress response, so for instance, maybe the easiest way for everybody in here to recognize a stress response is anybody not jumped into a cold lake in Wyoming? Is there anything but? And what happens when your heart goes below the water in the Snake River right now? When your heart goes below, what do you respond with? Does anybody know what we call this? What happens? As soon as your heart goes into cold water, anybody, come on. Nobody's jumped into cold water before?
Scream.
Okay, you might scream, but if you're far enough from the shore, what does your respirations do? Goes up, right? That's funny. Why does it go up?
Because you're stressed?
Well, specifically, the heart muscle, when it feels that rapid of a change, it thinks it's dying. It literally thinks there's a life threat going on. And you'll see people, have you ever seen anybody jump off a jump rock over on what's the lake? Phelps Lake. And they hit the water. And when they hit the water, they come up and they're like, and they're like frantically coming back to the shore. That's fight or flight. Why? They think they're dying. Okay? They think they're dying. And so the heart rate goes up. And so if the heart rate goes up, but if this vessel doesn't change, pressure increases on this side, and we have a reduction of oxygen on this side. If individuals can't stop that anxiety loop, well, the pressure keeps building, okay? The pressure keeps building. And so increase of pressure, decrease of O2. If this goes on long enough, cells in the heart begin to die. This is a heart attack. This is a heart attack. This is chest pain and difficulty breathing. Chest pain and difficulty breathing. Now, treatment for these folks, Seth.
Going back to the cold water subject.
Yeah.
I'm like kind of a fan of like cold showers and stuff like that, and like athletes take like cold baths.
I do cold plunges every day.
Yeah, they're like regenerative.
Yeah.
So like, what's kind of the difference there? Like, is it still the same response, just used in a more productive way?
Okay, so here's the deal. If you can reduce so here's the deal with stress. You either change your perception, which causes the stimuli to have less of an effect on you, or you remove yourself from the stimuli so that you don't have to deal with it anymore. If you keep living in the stimuli and don't change your perspective or your exposure to it, and it keeps beating you down, it'll knock your health down. But cold is a funny thing, which is that we think it's going to kill us. But we're not. We're actually built to live with no clothes on if we learn how to breathe properly. And we can stop nervous system response. This is the power of cold, which is that if you can breathe well, you can, and specifically the technique learned over a long period of time is that you breathe out as you're getting and submerging into cold water, and then you're also doing breathing patterns. But you've exposed yourself to the cold so much that you don't have a stress response to come to it. And so then when you get under it and you can relax, you turn your nervous system and you say, hey, this ain't gonna kill me. Don't ever be afraid of it. And guess what? You have less stress because of it. Why? Because as a mammal, cold water is supposed to kill us, but you can condition yourself to think it won't. Does that make sense? It's all nervous system interaction. It's all nervous system interaction. If you can calm your nervous system down around stressful environments, then when stress actually occurs, you can calm yourself down and not deal with the stress and be able to make decisions as opposed to reacting. Okay?
Are there any other physiological responses to the exposure to the cold beyond just the mental component?
Well, yes, because you have the mental component drives the whole physiological response. And so all of it is this, it's all belief. It's all belief, which is that whatever I believe is true and whatever you believe is true, that's called faith. People have been making a career out of that for millennia until most recently, where people don't think there's much to live for. Meaning, if you don't find meaning in life, well, then it's going to be difficult to actually find purpose and actually find value in anything. And that's actually part of this as well, because it's all mental. It's all mental. Here's the problem. If you get born to parents that have high cholesterol and heart disease, they tell you your whole life you're going to have heart disease and you're going to have high cholesterol. It's not how. The problem is that that's exactly how it works. It's not hereditary. It's belief. And as soon as we can change the belief structure of people, meaning their feeling changes, because you can think something but you don't believe it. But when you start to believe it, then you start having different endocrine responses, and then you start promoting health. And that's the whole trick here, because everybody comes back, they're like, it's in my family. I'm like, genetics don't work that way. They were taught to us that way, but it's epigenetics. What you believe drives your hormone response. Those hormones then tell your cells how to operate, and then your cells tell your DNA how to function. But if you start going lack of sleep, dehydrated, have shitty relationships, and so you start having bad thoughts, and then you have a poor diet on top of it, now all of a sudden you start driving an endocrine response that's driven by fight or flight all the time. And so if you've ever seen anybody that drinks coffee all day long, they're not killing themselves, they just have bad days. Meaning their endocrine response is hard to live with. They just don't know it. And that's the whole thing, which is that nobody knows health until you actually get it. Because you all feel fine right now, but I guarantee that everybody could feel better. Okay. Heart attack, chest pain, difficulty breathing. Now, treatment for these folks. Few things. One, 911. Okay? So give 911 a call. These folks are having a heart attack. We want to get them we want to get emergency services coming to us one way or the other. Second thing, the POC, or what we call the position of comfort. Okay? Position of comfort. Coach breathing. Okay? Coach breathing. Meaning they are going to be doing this. Or it could be like super dramatic, and it could be like, okay, heart attacks are all over the map. They can be pretty mild, or they can be pretty serious. But at the end of the day, you want to teach people to do this. Breathe in through their nose, pause, breathe out longer than they just breathed in, pause, and then breathe in again. So breathe in through the nose. So it looks like this. It's just... And so it's just putting pauses in between. What that breathing technique does, when you breathe in through your nose, pause, breathe out longer through your mouth than you just breathed in, it tells your nervous system that you're in control. It takes a few minutes, but you can reduce the heart rate and the respiratory rate, okay? Coach the breathing. Next, check for no aspirin allergies. And then what you're going to give them is, if there's no aspirin allergies, 4 times 81 milligrams children's chewables. Now, a few things here. If you're working in this valley, you carry children's chewable. Why? Because that's actually the protocol. It's not in an adult dose of aspirin. How does this work? You chew baby aspirin. It actually tastes pretty good, okay? It's normally a nice little flavor. You chew it. It gets pulled sublingual through your mucous membranes in the mouth, and it gets pulled into the bloodstream quite quick. It then reduces the clotting mechanism in the bloodstream, and it changes the consistency of the blood, and it allows the blood to pass through the occlusion easier. Reducing the blood pressure, reducing the heart rate and respiratory rate, and allowing the heart attack to go on longer, giving you more time to get them to help before they go into cardiac arrest. It's the whole trick here, okay? Again, for baby aspirin, if you've ever chewed in an adult dose, it tastes like battery acid, and then you have to give them water. Do not give people that are having a heart attack water. Why? Because they're going into surgery, and we don't want to have to pump their stomach, because it will take longer to get them into the ER. Hold on. If they're dying of thirst, take like a rag and just dip it in water and let them suck on it like a sponge so that they can satiate the dryness, and get the four children's chewables on board. Okay. Be honest with folks. Okay. Oftentimes when people are having heart attacks, they're in a little bit of denial. Something I was taught years ago as a very young EMT, which was be very honest with people about what you think is happening. And so, for instance, if you think a heart attack is happening, it's important to say to the person, it appears that you're having a heart attack. Do you have any aspirin allergies? No. Here, you're going to take 4 baby aspirin. We're going to call 911, and you should calm down. Let's start coaching your breathing, and let's try to calm yourself down, because the more you elevate, the more difficult you're gonna have time surviving. Seth.
Wouldn't it be better to not tell them that they had a heart attack?
No, because so the truth is actually less stressful than unknowing. And that is a fascinating thing about dying, which is fascinating, which is that this is how it was initially introduced to me, was this whole concept, which was like, oh, you're having a heart attack. And they look up at you and they go, that makes sense. And that's exactly what I've experienced every time I've been with somebody. It's like, it looks like you're having a heart attack. And they're like, I am having a heart attack. And they actually like lean into it. I'll put this into perspective for you. I had a 63-year-old ER doc from this valley who I rescued up on the pass about 10 years ago. He was having a heart attack. And when I got to him, I said, one, it looks like you're having a serious heart attack. I said, there's not much I can do for you. We had a tarp. And I was like, I got to load you onto a tarp. I said, there's a bunch of people here. We're going to move you in this tarp. I said, we have nothing to keep you warm. I said, but I've got a helicopter coming in. I was like, you need to calm down. You need to focus on your breathing. And you need to realize we are doing everything we can do for you. You have to do something for yourself right now. That was exactly what I said to him. And I was like, so I need you to calm down. I need you to focus on your breathing. Here's the humor of it. I met with him 3 weeks later. And he said to me at that time, he goes, thanks for the wake-up call. He goes, you had no idea who you were talking to. I go, no, I didn't. I still don't know. And he goes, I said, why was that so powerful? And he looked at me and he goes, I had just spent the last 15 years in Nepal teaching the monks emergency medicine. And he goes, and in return, they've been teaching me Buddhism, which is the practice of how to die. And he said, when you said to me, you're having a heart attack, you need to calm down. He said, I remembered everything they taught me, which was that I didn't want to be in an emotional mess when I was dying. I actually wanted to be calm and be present for when it occurred. That's part of the practice. The humor of the thing is that he started to meditate, and his heart attack should have killed him, but it didn't. He reduced his heart rate, he reduced his respiratory rate, and he reduced his blood pressure through his practice. And he's still with us today. And as he was joking with me, he was like, yeah, he goes, I'm actually living too good since I've been back here. He's like, I gained 25 pounds since I came back from Nepal. He goes, I was in a lot better health when I was living with the monks. He goes, good wake-up call. So there you go. Full Western doctor subscribing to Eastern practice. So heart attack. Questions, comments on this? Anything? This makes sense?
Is it possible to reverse a heart attack without definitive medical care?
So
Maybe reverse is the wrong term, but not die, I guess.
So interestingly enough, like for instance,
And what are we doing in definitive medical care?
so what we do in definitive medical care is we put a stent into here and we open this back up. The problem is that we make this wider, but there's multiple occlusions in the body. It's not like you just get one of those. And so that's what we do is we pop them back open. You can reverse this through reducing sugar in your diet. And if you reduce enough sugar in your diet, your body will then begin to attack fat and turn it into sugar, glucose. That's called ketosis. The problem is that you can't have any sugar on board. So for instance, folks that are obese, they go into what's called the obesity loop. And the obesity loop is that you have an occluded vessel. And so the vessel can't change size enough in order to accommodate for the physical activity. And so if you take somebody who's obese and you start exercising them, you put them into a stress response, they start secreting adrenaline and cortisol, they gain weight. It's whack. You don't even have to change their diet. They'll gain weight simply by adding more stress. And we see that in human beings all the time. That's inflammation. And it looks a little bit different on people from obesity fat, but whether it's all stress is the problem. And so obesity fat is often stress that's doubled with poor diet, but then you can have a mediocre diet and have enough stress and you just have inflammation throughout the body. And you can have this as well. You won't have this, but you'll have an inflammatory response that causes the vessel to be narrowed. Not so much the fat. The problem is that it's all coming from the same thing. It's all stress. So if you can't reduce the stress, you can't reduce the inflammation. The more stress you have, the more you crave inflammatory foods. It's that simple. The more you crave a cigarette, the more you crave a beer, the more you crave, just keep throwing the stress on and you want to have the coping mechanism. Okay? All right. Anything else out there? Okay, what's my time check? 6:50. I'm on point. Excellent. Take 10 minutes. Come on back in at 7 o'clock, and I'm going to flip the classroom over and have Zina take over. Right on. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, well, I'll have one of these guys.